Does legislation have an impact on school bullying? To talk about that with me, I'm joined by Massachusetts Representative John Scibak. He was on the committee to work out the difference between the House and Senate versions of the bill that the governor signed into law just a couple of years ago. As a state, where do we come when it stands to bullying? Where do we stand on this issue?
When we passed this law a few years ago, we were actually one of the premier states because we were tackling issues like cyberbullying that really hadn't been addressed in other states. You know, it's unfortunate it took a tragedy, and tragedies were here in Western Massachusetts. You know, whether it was Carl Walker Hoover or Phoebe Prince, both individuals committing suicide as a result of bullying led us to realize that bullying was far more prevalent than people had expected. And what we tried to do was come up with something that made sense, that provided a vehicle for schools to put something into place, develop a plan, to provide some assurance to both the students as well as their families that this would not be swept under the rug and would be actively and meaningfully addressed.
I know the New England Center for Investigative Reporting did a look into this, and they did a study basically saying the law was being called ineffective because it was unfunded and there was no real requirement for reporting by the schools. How do you kind of look at that and say, where's that balance between the schools' need to report to us, but then also not crossing that line of making it become more of an issue when it's not?
I think there were schools that were all over the map. You know, the unfunded mandate piece, at the time that it passed, we provided information and there were resources available through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education on relatively inexpensive or free bullying prevention programs. And it was more than just getting someone to come up and give a speech. You know, what I found certainly in South Hadley were people were coming to our community offering their services, and I'm wondering, are they really trying to exploit a school system that just went through a tragedy? So we were looking for programs that were evidence-based, that had some demonstrable data that proved that they worked. And there were some of those that were relatively inexpensive. And what we found is some school districts continued to do what they were doing because they had something in place. They were already addressing the issue. Others simply said, no, it's not much of a problem. And you're right. I think that report demonstrated that people are all over the map, that some school districts really weren't taking it either seriously or were collecting data and then putting it, you know, on a shelf somewhere, and we're not reporting it. And that's the unfortunate thing. We need to know whether what we're doing works. If a school district has something that's very successful and another school district has one that is having marginal success or may actually be getting worse, then it's important to look at what are they doing and what can we do to try to improve the situation.
Do you feel that we're not getting results on a state level because of the fact that the state is not this legislation is not requiring the schools to report? So why would they kind of step forward and say, yes, we have this number of incidents of bullying when before we didn't, and it kind of puts them maybe in that position to showcase their bullying efforts? Or,
you know, I think that may be part of the problem, but I think people need to recognize that when you ask someone to really start monitoring and assessing and evaluating, we weren't looking at it before. So a school district may say, you know, we weren't really collecting these data. So yeah, I will expect to see numbers that are higher those first few years, but eventually see them go down. And I don't think that a school district should be faulted for presenting and providing bullying data. If you talk to families, it still is pervasive. And we continue to see it across the country in terms of additional suicides. And the interesting thing is this only dealt with the schools. I've co-sponsored legislation to deal with bullying in the workplace. It is something that's pervasive in the society, and we need to try to change it. And we're not going to be able to change it overnight.
Would this be considered an unfunded mandate? Are the schools given the money to prevent bullying?
I think that there are ways that the schools could do it, as I said earlier, that there were curricula that were available at virtually no cost to the school system in the school districts. And I think it's important. It is no different than some other issues that we need to tackle, whether it's substance abuse in schools, whether it's looking at poor test results. The fact of the matter is, if there are problems and a school district says we can't comply, then at the very least, you know, let us know, and that should give us the impetus to provide funding. But schools were required to develop a plan, and frankly, some of the school districts did not develop that plan. Secondly, that there's a reporting mechanism, and what we're hearing in some cases across the Commonwealth is that parents or students are reporting bullying, and it doesn't seem as though anything's happening once that report goes in. That, I think, is a more serious issue than even the unfunded mandate situation.
Okay. Okay. Now, I did ask this question on Facebook. I said, do you feel state or federal legislation has an impact on school bullying? One of the responses I got said, I don't know, but I think institutions are probably putting a little too much emphasis on it. I mean, there has always been bullying, but now it's treated like an epidemic. How would you respond to that? Is it just that we're now more aware of bullying, or have the cases been rising? How do you explain that?
I think when we look at the outcomes, so we look at the number of suicides, and people will say, yes, bullying's always occurred, but do we have suicides as a result of bullying to the same degree that we're knowing now? I don't think it's something we can necessarily walk away from. And bullying today is far different than it was when I was in school, perhaps even when you were in school. You know, the notion of cyberbullying. So you might bully someone among a small circle of friends, and now it just takes one post that can go out to hundreds or thousands of individuals that psychologically just devastates a student who feels they have no choice but to commit suicide. That's a serious issue, and one I think we can't ignore.
And that's why this legislation has been put forward to try to prevent any of that from happening.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and speaking with me today about this.
My pleasure. Anytime.